Hello everyone, hope you are doing good. I am Muskan Singh Roha from second semester BE Economics Honors from Shivaji College. In this video, we are going to talk about winners and losers from trade, and this is a subtopic from applications of international trade. To study this, we need to look at some important terminologies that we will be using in our further discussion. So first we'll talk about closed economies and open economies. So a closed economy is an economy that has no economic relations with other countries of the world. That means there are only 2 or 3 sectors working in the country. The household sector, the firms, and the government may or may not interrupt. The producers supply what consumers demand, and the consumers demand what producers supply. The equilibrium price and quantities are determined by the market forces of demand and supply. Whereas in an open economy, one more sector comes in, that is the rest of the world. Open economy is opposite to closed economy. That means the country have economic relations with other countries in the world in terms of exports and imports. And now the equilibrium will be dependent on various factors as well. We will discuss in this chapter. Now, if a country wishes to change from a closed economy to an open economy, it will consider various factors. These are: what will happen to the price of commodity and its quantity in the domestic market, who will gain from the trade and who will lose, and the role of tariff in the process. In this video, we will study about the first 2 factors. To study this, we will take an example of an imaginary country called Exoland, and the commodity it is producing is steel in the domestic market. So our study is based on the following assumptions that we take. First, Exoland is a small economy. That means its entry or exit in the world market will not impact the already existing prices and quantities. So, Exoland is a price taker, not a price maker. So if free trade is allowed in domestic market, so the domestic prices will be equal to the world prices. That means no domestic consumer will pay the price more than the world price, and no domestic producer will sell the steel for a price lower than the world price. The second important thing is that to decide whether a country would be exporter or importer of a commodity, we will see if the country have a comparative advantage in production of that good or not. Comparative advantage is the ability of a country or an organization to carry out a economic activity more efficiently and at a relatively lower opportunity cost than the other. So simply we see if the world price is greater than the domestic price, we have an edge over the others in producing steel, and thus we will export steels. And similarly, if the world price is lower than the domestic price, Exoland does not have the comparative advantage, and the country will choose to import steel from the foreign market. So now first we'll talk about the gains and losses for an exporting country. We know a country will export if the world price is greater than the domestic price. See in this given diagram, the x-axis shows the quantity of steel and the y-axis shows the price of steel. DD is the downward sloping demand curve and DS is the upward sloping supply curve. The intersection of both demand and supply curve gives the price before trade or the equilibrium price in the closed economy. Now this red line shows the world price or the price after trade. Now look at the consumer surplus. Before the trade was allowed, consumer surplus is the area above the price line and below the demand curve. So the consumer surplus was A plus B. Now after the trade is allowed, the consumer surplus changes to only A, and the change in consumer surplus is minus B. That means there is a loss of consumer surplus by minus B units. Talking about producer surplus, earlier the producer surplus was the area above the supply curve and below the price line, that was only C. But now after the trade is allowed, at a new price, the producer surplus is the area B plus C plus D, and the change in producer surplus is plus B plus D. That is, the producer gains B plus D units. Now the total surplus, that is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, before trade was allowed was A plus B plus C, and after the trade is A plus B plus C plus D, and the change is plus D. This plus D is the area that shows increase in the total surplus and the gains from the trade. So D is the area where the domestic supply exceeds the domestic demand. So thus the area D is the value that would be exported to the rest of the world. So the domestic producers gained from the trade, that is the value D. Now we can conclude by saying that when trade is allowed and the country become exporter of the good, the domestic producers are better off because the producer surplus increases, and the domestic consumers are worse off because the consumer surplus decreases. But the overall economic well-being of the nation increases because the gains to the winners exceed the losses to the losers. That means the overall surplus of the economy increases. Similarly, when we talk about the gains and losses to an importing country, as we discussed before, a country will import if the domestic price is more than the world price. So that means we don't have a comparative advantage in producing that commodity. See the diagram. Again, the x-axis represents the quantity of steel and the y-axis represents the price of steel. DD is the downward sloping demand curve and DS is the upward sloping supply curve. Their intersection shows the equilibrium, that is the price, that is price before trade, and the red line is the world price, that is the price after trade. Before the trade was allowed, the consumer surplus is the area above the price line and below the demand curve. So before the trade was allowed, the consumer surplus was the area A. Now at a new price, that the world price, the consumer surplus is A plus B plus D, and the change in consumer surplus is plus B plus D, means the consumers gain the area B plus D. Talking about producer surplus, the area above the domestic supply curve and below the price line. The producer surplus before trade was B plus C, and after trade it is just C. The change is minus P, that shows the loss to the consumer surplus. The total surplus earlier was A plus B plus C. Now after trade it is A plus B plus C plus D, and the change is plus D. This area shows the increase in total surplus and represents the gain from the trade. This area D is where the domestic demand exceeds the domestic supply, and to meet up with this demand, the country will have to import the value D. To conclude, we can say that when trade is allowed and the country become importer of a good, domestic producers are worse off as the producer surplus decreases, and the domestic consumers are better off as the consumer surplus increases. But the overall economic well-being of the nation increases because the gains to the winners exceed the losses to the losers. That means the total surplus of the country increases. So this is all for the video. I hope that was insightful for you all. Thank you and have a nice day.